What would you do if the entire town laughed in your face the day you spent your last dollar? And the joke turned out to be on all of them. For Clementine Hayes, a widow with nothing left but a black mourning dress and a small tin of coins scraped together from a life she hadn't asked for, this wasn't a question. It was the cold, hard silence that followed her out of the land office, the snicker she pretended not to hear, the bill of sale folded into her pocket like a piece of shame. She had bought the sandstone salt works, a dead claim, a dry crust of white earth at the edge of the Nevada basin that hadn't produced a single usable ton of salt in 11 years. Everyone in Marrow Flat knew it. Everyone but her, they said, or so they thought. But what happened next in the heat and the silence of that forsaken flat would unearth a secret that had been buried under a decade of greed. The truth was waiting for her, hidden inside solid rock, in a place everyone had already written off as finished. Settle in and let the dust of the salt flats settle with you. This is a story about the things we throw away and the treasures they hold inside. The laughter had started the moment she signed her name. Clementine remembered every detail of it, the way a person remembers the exact second a bone breaks. The land agent, a soft, sweating man named Prout, had slid the deed across the counter and asked her twice if she understood what she was buying. Not once had he asked if she wanted to buy it. Twice he asked if she understood. "It's dry, ma'am," he'd said, his mustache twitching with something between pity and amusement. Dry as a bone. Nobody's pulled a pound of salt out of that ground since before the war ended. "I understand," she'd said, and set down the coins. Behind her, at the long table by the window, 3 men from the Cattlemen's Association had stopped their card game to watch. One of them, a broad man in a gray coat with silver at his temples, had laughed first, a short, barking sound that cut through the quiet office like a whip crack. Harlan Voss. Clementine knew the name the way everyone in Marrow Flat knew it. He owned the bank, the freight line, half the grazing land between the basin and the mountains, and some said in low voices, never to his face, most of the town council besides. A woman buying a dead salt mine, Voss had said to no one and everyone. Well, I suppose grief does strange things to a person's judgment. Not cruelly, exactly. Worse than cruelly, carelessly, the way men laugh at something too small to matter. And the other men had laughed along with him. Clementine had not turned around. She had folded the deed, tucked it into the pocket of her dress, and walked out into the white glare of the afternoon, her spine straight as a fence post, her eyes dry. Plenty of tears had already been spent on Daniel. She would not spare any more of them here in front of them. 6 months earlier, she had buried her husband, Daniel, after a fever swept through the mining camp where he'd worked as an assier. 3 months after that, she had buried the last of the money he'd left her into a lawyer's fee, fighting off his brother's claim to what little remained of their small house. What remained after all of it was $340, a black dress, and a decision that everyone in town seemed to believe was proof she had lost her mind entirely. Daniel Hayes had been a careful man, a patient man, the kind who read rock the way other men read scripture. He had courted her with samples of quartz and mica instead of flowers, laying each one in her palm and explaining, in a low, earnest voice, what forces of pressure and time had made it. She had married him for that patience, for the way he looked at the world as though every dead, discarded thing still had a story worth telling if a person only troubled themselves to listen. She had not expected to bury that patience in a shallow grave outside a mining camp before her 26th birthday. She had not expected either that the only inheritance he would leave her, beyond the debts his brother tried to pin on her, would be a habit of mind so thoroughly instilled that she could not look at a stretch of dead ground without hearing his voice asking what it might be hiding. That voice, more than any courage of her own, had carried her into the land office that morning with her last dollars in hand. Amos Feathering, an old prospector with no kin and no debts, had left the sandstone salt works to auction when he died, which made it one of the rare parcels in the county not tangled in some rancher's claim or bank's lien. 300 acres of white, cracked earth, a played-out evaporation works, 2 collapsed sheds, and a mine shaft sunk 40 feet into a low ridge of gray rock that everyone agreed held nothing anymore. Nothing but dust and disappointment, and a woman's stubborn refusal to leave town with her tail between her legs. Alone, in a borrowed wagon, she rode out to it the next morning. Because there was no one left to send with her and no one willing to go, the land unrolled before her in a great flat sheet of white, blinding under the sun, broken only by the low ridge where the mine sat like a scar. It looked, she thought, exactly like what everyone had told her it was. Dead. The first week went to whatever small tasks she could manage. She cleared brush from the collapsed sheds. She patched the roof of the smaller one enough to sleep under it. She walked the flats with a shovel, digging test holes the way Daniel had once shown her, back when he still believed there was a future for the two of them in this hard country. The salt crust broke apart in dry, papery sheets. Beneath it, more dust, more disappointment. By the second week, her hands were blistered and her food was running low, and the voice in the back of her mind, the one that sounded uncomfortably like Harlan Voss, had begun to whisper that perhaps she really had lost her judgment to grief. Not because she was certain she was right, but because she had nothing left to lose by being wrong, she refused to listen to it. A wagon came out from town on the fourth day, though not to help her. 2 boys from the general store, sent by their mother with a basket of bread she hadn't asked for and hadn't the pride left to refuse, lingered at the edge of the flat just long enough to stare at the cracked white earth and the sagging sheds and report back. With the cruel honesty of children, exactly what they'd seen. By the following morning, half of Marrow Flat seemed to know that the widow Hayes was living out of a patched shed on dead ground, sleeping on a cot beside a rusted axe, digging holes that filled with nothing but dust. Word reached her second hand that Harlan Voss had made a small joke of it at the bank counter, something about charity being wasted on a woman too stubborn to accept a lost cause. It came from the same boy's mother, who delivered it with the particular gentleness people reserve for telling someone something they suspect will wound. It wounded. She let it wound her for exactly one evening, sitting on the shed's crooked step with the sunset burning the flat into a sheet of copper fire, and then she rose the next morning and went back to digging. It was on the 9th day, in the hour before sunset when the light turned the whole basin the color of a healing bruise, that she noticed something odd about the mine shaft. Rotted through in places, the old timbers framing its mouth told part of the story, and a section of the collapsed wall near the entrance had crumbled further since her arrival, exposing a thin seam of darker rock beneath the pale gray. She might not have noticed it at all if not for the strange dampness clinging to the base of that seam. A faint, cool moisture in ground that had not seen real rain in months. Everyone knew the sandstone works was dry, bone dry. It was the first thing anyone said about the place, the way people say the sky is blue, but dampness did not lie the way people did. Kneeling in the fading light, she pressed her fingers to the dark stone. Cool, almost cold, a thread of moisture, thin as a hair, tracing down into a crack no wider than her smallest finger. Daniel's memory surfaced then, of the 100 nights he'd sat across from her at their kitchen table, with a rock sample turning in his hands, explaining how a vein of one mineral so often traveled alongside another, how water found its way through stone along paths invisible to anyone who didn't know how to look. She had absorbed more of his trade than she'd ever told him in those quiet evenings. She had absorbed enough, perhaps, to notice what an entire town of men who thought they knew everything had somehow failed to see in more than a decade of walking past it. There was an old felling axe leaning against the shed, left behind by Amos Feathering, along with a handful of other rusted tools nobody had bothered to haul away. She fetched it the next morning before the heat became unbearable, and she stood at the mouth of the mine shaft studying that seam of darker rock, that thread of dampness, for a long, still moment. A fool for spending her last dollar on dry ground, that was what the town had called her. She swung the axe. The blade bit into the seam with a sound like a shot, and a chunk of the crumbling rock face sheared away and fell in a cascade of gray dust. She swung again, harder, driven by 6 months of swallowed grief and swallowed laughter, and the wall gave way further, opening a gap black as a closed eye. And out of that gap, into the dry morning air of a place everyone swore had been drained of everything it would ever give, came the unmistakable, cool exhale of moving water. What would you do if the ground everyone called dead turned out to be hiding the one thing that could save you? And destroy the man who buried it. If you're finding yourself pulled into Clementine's story, we'd love to have you along for more. Be sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments what you would have done in her place. Now, let's go back and see how Marrow Flat came to bury its darkest secret beneath a salt flat everyone had already forgotten. The water was not a flood and not a stream. It was a slow, patient seep from somewhere deep within the ridge. The same kind of geological weeping that had, over some forgotten span of years, dissolved and carried mineral salts up through the rock to crust the surface white, before something long ago had choked off its path to the open air. Clementine did not understand the science of it, not fully. But she understood enough to know that dry ground did not seep water, and she understood enough to widen the gap with the axe, her palms screaming with blisters, her breath coming in short, disbelieving gasps, until the opening was large enough for her narrow shoulders to pass through. She should not have gone in alone. She knew that even as she did it, but 6 months of being told what a sensible woman would do had left her with very little patience left for sensible. The passage beyond the gap sloped gently downward, following the thread of moisture, the walls close enough on either side to brush her shoulders. The air grew cooler with every step, and after perhaps 30 feet, the narrow passage opened into a low chamber. And there her borrowed lantern light caught something that made her stop breathing entirely. Not gold, not silver, not yet. Water. A shallow, dark pool of it, fed by a spring bubbling silently up through a fissure in the chamber's floor, spreading out to fill a natural basin in the stone before disappearing again through some hidden channel deeper in the rock. Enough water, she realized with a slow, dizzying comprehension, to irrigate the entire dead flat above. Enough water to turn 300 acres of salt-crusted nothing into something else entirely. But it was what stood at the edge of that pool that made her sink to her knees. A stack of wooden crates, swollen and split with age, their iron bands rusted to lace. And beside them, half sunk in the shallow water as if someone had meant to hide them and been interrupted before they could finish, 3 canvas sacks, their fabric rotted through in places to reveal the dull, unmistakable gleam of raw silver ore. This was no natural cavern that some careless prospector had simply failed to find. This was a place someone had gone to great trouble to seal shut. She had come looking for salt. She had found the reason an entire town had spent more than a decade convincing itself there was nothing here worth finding. Trouble, in Jonah Reed's experience, always came looking for you whether you wanted it or not, and he had already had his fill of it to last 3 lifetimes. He had not gone looking for any of this. Running a small string of horses on a lease at the foot of the mountains, he kept to the edges of Marrow Flat, close enough to town to sell what he needed to sell and far enough away that most folks forgot he existed between visits. That suited him. 2 years earlier, his wife Sarah had died of a rattlesnake bite while he was 3 days out on a cattle drive, and the town doctor paid, everyone whispered but no one proved, by Harlan Voss's money, had been slow enough getting to her. That by the time help arrived, help no longer meant anything at all. Jonah had buried her himself, on a low rise overlooking the mountain she'd loved, and he had not fully trusted another human soul since. Riding the fence line at the edge of his lease that afternoon, he noticed dust rising from the direction of the old sandstone works. Too much dust for one woman clearing brush, not enough for a wagon train. He rode toward it out of habit more than curiosity. The same instinct that had once made him a fair tracker before he traded that life for a quieter one. Clementine was sitting at the mouth of the mine shaft when he found her, her dress torn at the shoulder, her hands raw, her face streaked with dust and something that might have been tears or might have been the aftermath of shock. Beside her, a canvas sack had spilled open, and even from 10 feet away, Jonah could see the dull gray gleam inside it. "Ma'am," he said carefully, dismounting slow, hands visible. "You all right?" She looked up at him with the particular wariness of a woman who had learned, recently and thoroughly, not to trust the kindness of strangers. Depends, she said, on whether you work for Harlan Voss. I don't work for anybody, Jonah said. Never have been able to stomach it. Something in the flatness of his voice, the plainness of it, seemed to loosen something in her shoulders. She studied him a moment longer and then, wordlessly, she pushed the sack toward him with the toe of her boot. Jonah knelt and lifted a handful of the ore, turning it in the fading light. He had spent enough years around mining camps to know raw silver when he held it, and enough years around men like Harlan Voss to understand, in one cold instant, exactly what kind of trouble he had just ridden into. "This come from in there?" he asked, nodding toward the mine shaft. "There's a whole chamber," Clementine said. "Crates, sacks of it, a spring running right through the middle. Enough water to turn every acre of this basin green." She paused. "Somebody sealed it up on purpose, a long time ago." Jonah set the ore down slowly, his jaw working. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the dark mouth of the shaft as if it might answer the question forming behind his eyes. "There a name in there?" he asked finally. "Papers, ledgers, anything with a name on it?" "I didn't look that far," Clementine admitted. "I got scared of the dark and my own good sense caught up with me." "Smart," Jonah said. "This is the kind of hole a person can go into and not come back out of." He looked at her, weighing something. "I lost my wife 2 years back. Dr. Voss pays for was slow getting to her. I've had 2 years to wonder exactly how deep that man's hands go into this valley, and I've never had a single scrap of proof to show for the wondering." Clementine felt something shift between them, two strangers, each carrying the same shape of grief, each circling the same unspoken name. "Then maybe," she said, her voice low, "it's time we went looking for proof together." They went back in the next morning, lanterns lit, a crowbar borrowed from Jonah's saddlebag, the pool of spring water rippling silver black in the lantern light. The crates, when they pried them open, held more raw ore, badly stored and half ruined by decades of damp, but ore nonetheless, enough of it that even Jonah, who had seen his share of mining operations, let out a low whistle. It was the smaller box, tucked behind the crates and sealed with wax gone brittle with age, that mattered most. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and yellow, they found 2 ledgers and a stack of letters bound with twine that broke apart in Jonah's hands the moment he touched it. The ledgers told a story written in dry, careful columns of numbers, payments made, or weighed, dates recorded with the meticulous hand of a man who never expected anyone else to read them. The mine, they learned, had once produced not salt but silver, a rich vein discovered by Amos Feathering himself nearly 15 years earlier, before the town of Marrow Flat had grown into anything resembling what it was now. But the second ledger, and the letters bound beside it, told a darker story. Harlan Voss's name appeared again and again, in transactions that made no honest sense. Payments to a surveyor for a report that falsely declared the vein exhausted. Payments to the county assessor's office for a filing that reclassified the land as a salt works instead of a silver claim, quietly, without ceremony, the kind of paperwork nobody but a banker with friends in every office would think to arrange. And beneath all of it, in Amos Feathering's own increasingly shaky hand, a final entry that made Jonah's blood run cold. "Voss come again today. 3rd time this month. Offered to buy me out for a pittance, said the vein was near tapped anyway. No sense fighting it. I told him I know what I dug out of that ground and I know what it's worth, and I'll see him in hell before I sign over a $15,000 vein for the price of a milk cow. He smiled at me the way a man smiles at a dog he's already decided to shoot. The date on that entry was 11 years old. 11 years, almost to the month, before Clementine had bought the land at auction, sold, the county records showed, as an unremarkable dry salt claim. Its silver history erased from every public document as thoroughly as if it had never existed at all. He didn't want the mine dead, Jonah said slowly, the pieces settling into place with the terrible clarity of a puzzle finally solved. He wanted the asterisk world to think it was dead, so he could buy it back cheap whenever it suited him, and nobody would ever ask why a banker wanted a worthless piece of ground. "And Amos Feathering," Clementine said, her voice thin. "He died before that could happen." "Died," Jonah repeated. And the word hung there between them, heavy with a question neither of them wanted to say aloud. Jonah sat back on his heels beside the shallow spring pool, turning one of the ledgers slowly in his hands, and for a long while neither of them spoke. The lantern hissed and guttered against the damp chamber air, throwing their shadows long and strange across the water. "You know what gets me," he said finally, "isn't even the theft of it. Men have stolen land since there's been land to steal. It's the patience. 11 years of quiet paperwork, small bribes, careful smiles, just so nobody would ever think to ask a question at the wrong moment. That's not greed you stumble into. That's greed a man builds brick by brick, the same way you'd build a house." "My husband used to say rock doesn't lie," Clementine said quietly, running her thumb along the water-stained edge of a page. "People can build whatever story they like on top of the ground. But the ground itself only ever tells the truth if you're patient enough to ask it properly." She looked toward the dark passage leading back up toward the surface, toward the wide, cracked salt flat that had fooled an entire town for over a decade. "I think that's the only reason any of this got found at all. Voss could buy every assessor and every doctor in the valley. He couldn't buy the water. It kept telling the truth the whole time, whether anyone was listening or not." The full shape of the conspiracy did not reveal itself in the cold numbers of the ledgers. It came instead in the fragile, water-stained pages of the letters. A long, unfinished correspondence between Amos Feathering and a lawyer in the territorial capital, a man he'd apparently hired in secret to help him fight off Voss's increasingly aggressive attempts to force a sale. "If anything happens to me before this is settled," one letter read, in handwriting grown shakier by the month. "I want it known that the vein is real, that Voss has known it since the summer of '78, and that every dry claim he's bought cheap and sat on in this valley since then was likely bought the same way, a rigged survey, a friendly assessor, and a man too old and too alone to fight back." Clementine read that passage twice, her hands trembling, and looked up to find Jonah's face gone hard and still in the lantern light. "Every dry claim," he repeated. "There's at least 4 others like this one scattered around the basin. Old Widow Marsh's played out well lot. The Kessler brothers' abandoned quarry. Half the town's been laughing at fools for a decade, and every single one of those fools bought land that Harlan Voss quietly wanted kept worthless until he could scoop it up for nothing. He's not just a banker who got lucky," Clementine said, the full weight of it settling cold in her chest. "He built this entire valley on land he stole from dead men and desperate strangers, and dressed every theft up as a bad investment." The last letter in the bundle, dated only 2 weeks before county records showed Amos Feathering's death, was addressed not to the lawyer but to Voss himself, a draft never sent, the ink blotted in places as though the old man's hand had shaken too badly to finish it in one sitting. "You will not have this mine, Harlan. I have sent copies of everything to Prescott. The day you think you've finally won is the day it all comes back on you." There was no evidence the letter had ever reached the lawyer in Prescott. There was no evidence Amos Feathering had lived long enough to send it at all. "We need to know how he died," Clementine said, her voice subdued. Jonah's face was grim. "I know a man in town who dug the grave," he said. "Might be time we paid him a visit." The gravedigger, an old, quiet man named Ezra Combs, did not want to talk. It took Jonah a full afternoon of careful, patient questions, and the promise that nothing said would ever be traced back to him, before Ezra finally admitted, in a low voice, that Amos Feathering had not died of the fever the town had been told. "Found him at the bottom of his own mine shaft," Ezra said, not meeting either of their eyes. "Doc Prout, the land agent's brother, mind you, signed the paper saying it was an accidental fall. But I helped carry the body out myself, and there wasn't a scratch on that man's hands. A man falls down a mine shaft, he claws at the walls on the way down. His hands were clean, clean as a church floor." He paused, and something like shame crossed his weathered face. "Voss paid for the burial, paid for it generous too. I always figured a man don't pay generous for a stranger's grave unless he's got a reason to want folks grateful and quiet." The truth, once spoken aloud, settled over the 3 of them like a physical weight. Amos Feathering had not died of fever or of a careless fall. He had died protecting a secret that Harlan Voss had spent a decade and untold dollars making sure the entire valley believed was worthless dust. And now that secret sat, uncovered, in the hands of a grieving widow and a grieving rancher. Two people the town had already decided didn't matter enough to be believed. Ezra Combs would not go so far as to sign his name to anything. Not yet, not with Voss still walking free and powerful in the same town where Ezra dug graves for a living and buried nothing but the truth alongside the bodies. But before they left, he pressed one more piece of information into Jonah's hand, low and urgent, as though the words themselves might get him killed for speaking them. "There's a fifth claim," Ezra said, "older than any of the others. Before the Kessler quarry, before the widow Marsh's well lot. A homestead out past the northern ridge, belonged to a family named Ortiz. Filed rich, sold for nothing. Same year Voss first came into money nobody could account for. Nobody talks about it because there's nobody left to ask. Whole family moved on, or so the story goes." He would not meet their eyes as he said it. "I've buried men in this county for 30 years, and I've learned there's a difference between a story folks tell because it's true, and a story folks tell because it's easier than asking questions." Clementine felt the ground of her own certainty shift and widen beneath her. This was not simply the theft of one dead prospector's silver. It was a pattern, stretching back further than either of them had imagined, built on land taken from the desperate, the grieving, the already erased, anyone with no one left to ask why their fortune had vanished into another man's ledger. "How many more?" she murmured. "Do you suppose there are, that nobody's ever bothered to count?" Neither Jonah nor Ezra had an answer for her. The silence that followed said more than any number could have. The valley had grown uneasy in the days since Clementine's return from the mine, though no one in town could quite have said why. Rumors traveled faster than facts in a place like Marrow Flat, and word had already spread distorted, half-true, growing stranger with every retelling that the widow Hayes had found something out at the old sandstone works. Some said water, some said gold. A few, closer to the truth than they knew, said silver, and laughed it off as the same kind of foolishness that had made her buy the place to begin with. Harlan Voss did not laugh it off. He had a man on his payroll, a soft-spoken, watchful tracker named Silas Duke, whose official job was overseeing Voss's freight line and whose unofficial job, understood by everyone who worked for the bank but spoken of by no one, was making sure nothing inconvenient ever surfaced in the valley for long. Voss called him into the back office of the bank on a hot afternoon 3 days after Clementine's discovery and laid it out plainly. "The widow's been out at the old works," Voss said, not looking up from the ledger on his desk. "And she's been seen riding with Jonah Reed. That man's had a grudge against this town since his wife passed, and I don't like the two of them putting their heads together." "You want me to talk to them?" Duke asked. "I want you to find out exactly what she's found," Voss said. "And if it's what I think it is, I want it gone before it ever reaches a courthouse. Whatever that takes." Duke did not ask what "whatever that takes" asterisk meant. He had worked for Harlan Voss for 6 years, and he had learned a long time ago that some questions were better left unasked. What would you do if the man who buried your husband's memory in false paperwork was the same man who could still bury you? If Clementine and Jonah's fight for the truth has you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to leave a comment telling us what you think Harlan Voss will do next. Now, back to the valley, where the storm, in more ways than one, is about to break. 2 days later, Clementine and Jonah rode out to the mine at first light, intending to gather a fuller sample of the ore and copy out the most damning entries from the ledgers before making the long ride to the territorial capital. Neither of them had any illusions about what would happen if they waited too long, or trusted the wrong person in Marrow Flat with what they knew. Through the morning they worked in the cool chamber beside the spring, the lantern light throwing long shadows across the water, the ledgers spread out on a flat stone between them as Jonah copied entries in his slow, careful hand and Clementine sorted the letters by date, building as complete a picture of Voss's decade-long scheme as the fragile paper would allow. It was midday when they heard the first low rumble of thunder rolling down off the mountains, and by the time they climbed back up through the narrow passage to check the sky, The horizon to the west had gone the color of a fresh bruise, dark clouds building fast over the peaks in the particular, violent way that summer storms built in that country, from clear sky to downpour in the space of an hour, sometimes less. "We should go," Jonah said, already moving toward the horses. "This basin floods quick when the mountains let loose. That mine shaft's low ground. We don't want to be caught down there when it does." They had gathered barely half their saddlebags when the second sound reached them, not thunder, but hoofbeats, coming fast from the direction of town. Sela's Duke reined in his horse at the mouth of the mine shaft with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had done this kind of work before. His rifle resting loose across his saddle, his eyes moving over the scattered saddlebags, the ledgers still visible through the gap in the rock, and finally settling on Clementine and Jonah with the flat, assessing look of a predator confirming its meal. "Mr. Voss sent me to have a friendly word," Duke said, his voice pleasant in a way that made the hair on Clementine's arms rise. "Seems there's some confusion about what belongs to who out here." "There's no confusion," Jonah said evenly, positioning himself slightly in front of Clementine without seeming to move at all. "The deed's in her name, filed proper at the county office." "Deeds can be amended," Duke said, "especially when the man doing the amending owns the assessor's supper table." He swung down off his horse, slow and deliberate. "Now, I'd rather this go easy. Hand over whatever paper you've been copying out of that hole, and we'll all ride back to town like civilized folks." Fat drops of rain began spattering against the dry rock as he spoke, and somewhere above the ridge, lightning split the darkening sky. Jonah's hand moved, unhurried, toward the rifle still slung across his own saddle, but Duke's rifle came up faster, the barrel steadying on Jonah's chest with the ease of long practice. "I wouldn't," Duke said, almost gently. The standoff held for one long, taut second, the rain thickening around them, thunder rolling closer down the ridge. And then Clementine, moving on nothing but raw instinct, hurled the lit lantern she'd been holding directly at Duke's feet. It shattered against the rock in a burst of flame and shadow, and in the half-second of confusion that followed, Jonah lunged. The two men went down together in the mud already forming at the mine's entrance, grappling for the rifle, rain sheeting down around them in sudden, violent force as the storm broke fully over the ridge. Clementine scrambled for the fallen weapon on instinct, her hands shaking, and when Duke's boot caught Jonah hard across the jaw and sent him sprawling, she did not hesitate. She swung the rifle stock, not the barrel, catching Duke across the back of the skull with every ounce of strength 6 months of grief and fury had built into her arms. He dropped like a felled tree into the mud, unconscious, rain already pooling around his still form. For a long moment, neither Clementine nor Jonah moved, the storm roaring around them, the mine's dark mouth breathing its cool, damp air into the chaos of the downpour. "We crossed a line just now," Jonah said finally, wiping blood from his split lip, staring down at the unconscious tracker. "There's no riding away from this quiet anymore." "No," Clementine agreed, her voice steadier than she felt. "But we've got him, the ledgers, and the truth. That's more than Amos Feathering ever had a chance to hold onto." Duke's wrists were bound with a length of rope from the saddlebags, the ledgers and a sample of ore loaded into their own, and by the time the storm began to slacken toward evening, the floodwaters that had briefly turned the low ground of the basin into a shallow, churning lake were already beginning to recede, leaving the salt flats glistening and strange in the last gray light. There was no going back to Marrow Flat now, not with what they knew. Eastward through the night they rode instead. Toward the territorial capital and whatever justice waited there, Duke slung, bound and silent, over a lead horse behind them, and the truth of 11 stolen years riding in the saddlebags between them. A camp made without a fire, for fear of who might be watching the ridgelines for exactly that kind of light, was cold and silent that first night. Clementine lay awake long after Jonah had taken the first watch, staring up at a sky scattered thick with stars. Listening to Duke's ragged, resentful breathing where he lay bound a short distance away. She thought of Daniel, of the quiet evenings at their kitchen table, of how astonished he would have been, how proud, perhaps, in his careful, understated way, to know that the habit of mind he'd given her without ever meaning it as a gift had led her, eventually, to this. A ledger full of a dead man's stolen fortune, a tracker bound in the dirt beside her. A truth large enough to break an entire town's carefully polished reputation. She did not sleep much that night. She did not need to. Fear had burned itself out somewhere back at the mine, in the moment she'd swung a rifle stock instead of waiting to be told what a sensible woman ought to do, and what remained in its place was something steadier, harder, closer to resolve. The ride to Prescott took 2 hard days, skirting Marrow Flat entirely under cover of darkness the first night to avoid any of Voss's other eyes and ears along the road. Clementine and Jonah spoke little as they rode, each carrying the private, exhausted weight of what they'd become, no longer simply a widow and a rancher nursing separate griefs, but 2 people who now held, quite literally, the power to unmake an entire town's carefully constructed lie. They reached the territorial marshal's office on the evening of the second day, trail-worn, soaked through from a second brief storm, and utterly determined. Marshal Elias Cobb was a tall, gray-eyed man with a reputation. Even that far from Marrow Flat, for an incorruptibility that had made him few friends among the territory's wealthier men and considerable respect among everyone else. He listened to their account without interruption, his expression giving away nothing, and when they finished, he gestured for the ledgers. He read through them methodically, page by page, the fire in the office hearth crackling low as full night settled outside. He paused longest over Amos Feathering's final, unsent letter. And when he finally looked up, something had shifted behind his gray eyes. "I've had my own private suspicions about Harlan Voss for the better part of 2 years," Cobb said. "Assessor reports that don't match survey records, land parcels that change hands for a fraction of their worth right before a boom nobody saw coming except the man buying them. I never had proof solid enough to act on." He tapped the ledger. "This is proof." A clerk was summoned to examine the paper and ink of the older ledger, confirming its age against Amos Feathering's known handwriting from other county filings. Duke, brought in under guard and faced with the ledgers, the letters, and the marshal's flat, unblinking stare, did not hold out long. His confession, given in exchange for leniency, confirmed everything: the rigged surveys, the falsified assessments, and Harlan Voss's direct order to silence Clementine and Jonah by whatever means necessary. Marshal Cobb deputized Jonah on the spot, a silent acknowledgement of the man's steadiness under pressure, and gathered a small posse of his own trusted men before riding back toward Marrow Flat at first light. The arrival of federal lawmen in Marrow Flat sent a ripple of confusion through the town that quickly curdled into shock. Harlan Voss was taken from behind his own bank desk, his face a mask of disbelief that gave way, within the hour, to something closer to hollow understanding as the ledgers were read aloud in the makeshift hearing held in the town hall. The county assessor was arrested alongside him. Dr. Prout, brother to the land agent who had so casually mocked Clementine's purchase, was questioned about the falsified cause of Amos Feathering's death, and under the weight of Ezra Combs's testimony, eventually confirmed what everyone had long suspected but no one had dared to say aloud. One by one, the hidden architects of Marrow Flat's prosperity were revealed as thieves who had built an entire town's fortune on land stolen from the desperate, the dead, and the dismissed. The townspeople who had once laughed alongside Voss at the widow with the worthless salt claim now watched in stunned, uneasy silence as he was led in chains toward the prison wagon. For a moment as he passed, his eyes found Clementine standing beside Jonah at the edge of the crowd, and something in his face, the same cold, possessive certainty she remembered from the land office that first humiliating day, finally, completely, gave way. He was not merely defeated, he was undone. His careful decade of lies collapsing all at once, in front of the very town he had spent it deceiving. Months passed, and the valley slowly began to breathe again in a way it had not in years. reclassified, this time honestly, as the feathering silver claim in honor of the old prospector who had died protecting it. The sandstone salt works became the foundation of a fortune Clementine had never once set out to find. But it was the spring, more than the silver, that changed the shape of the whole basin. Channeled and dug out properly under Jonah's careful direction, its steady flow turned 300 acres of salt-crusted nothing into the first genuinely fertile ground the valley had ever known. The cabin they built together sat at the edge of that new green, its foundation solid, its walls raised from timber Jonah had milled himself. The old felling axe that had cracked open the mine's secret hung now above the hearth, more relic than tool. A lasting reminder of the morning a laughed-at widow had refused to accept that dry ground had nothing left to give. One evening, as the sun dropped low over the mountains and painted the young irrigation channels gold, Jonah paused at the fence line he'd been mending, leaning on the rail beside her. "Marshall's letter came today," he said. "Voss's trial's set for spring. Won't be a short one, with everything they found once they started pulling threads. 4 other claims just like ours. Widow Marsh's lot, the Kessler quarry, all of it rigged the same way." Clementine looked out over the green stretching where white salt had once cracked in the sun, her hands rough now with honest work, her grief settled into something quieter than it had been, something closer to peace. "There's word from the northern ridge, too," Jonah added, more carefully. "Marshall's men found what's left of the old Ortiz homestead. No bodies, just an abandoned well and a burned-out cabin foundation and a filing in the county records that doesn't match anything else in the book." He looked at her. "Cobb's sending riders to try and track down what happened to the family. Might take years, might never turn up an answer at all." "Then we'll wait," Clementine said. "However long it takes. Somebody looked the other way on that family once. I don't intend to be the second person who does." She thought of Amos Feathering's shaking handwriting, of the letter he never got the chance to send, of the strange, quiet justice of a dead man's warning finally reaching the ears it had been meant for all along. 11 years too late to save him, but not too late, perhaps, to save what he'd left behind. She thought of every claim Voss had smiled his way into owning, every widow and stranger and grieving family the valley had decided wasn't worth a second look. "The silver wasn't the treasure," she said finally. "It was just the key. This," she gestured at the water, the green, the solid cabin behind them, "this is the treasure. But it's not the last key we're going to find in this valley, Jonah. Not by a long way." Jonah looked at her for a long moment, something soft finally breaking through the grief that had lived so long in his face, and he did not disagree. He reached over and took her hand, rough palm against rough palm, 2 people who had each been told, in their own private griefs, that what they had left was worthless, standing now on ground that had proven, in the plainest way the earth knew how, exactly how wrong that judgment had been. "Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story of quiet defiance and hard-won justice. It's a reminder that sometimes the things the world calls worthless are only waiting for someone brave enough or stubborn enough to look closer." If Clementine and Jonah's story moved you, we'd be honored if you'd leave a like and tell us in the comments what part of their journey stayed with you the most. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of courage from the forgotten frontier. We'll see you next time. Total, 88 paragraphs.